We're going to be staying with Nvidia for this just quickly because, well, there was a bit of a surprise added to the Nvidia app that we weren't clued in on at any point during the proceedings. It looks as though Nvidia has produced their own version of AMD's hilariously titled AFMF. And it's called Nvidia Smooth Motion. And I tried to take a look at it this morning with not much success. But Alex, you have been using it. You have tested it. I'm curious what your thoughts are here. Smooth motion, essentially, it's basically full optical flow without any integration at the game level. It's done at the driver level. So we could expect that you will see more frames, obviously, but the quality of those frames won't be anywhere near as good as DLSS 4, etc., etc. But what do you make of it?
Well, in NVIDIA's press material, they are saying it is a machine learning based frame interpolator. So that would put it different than using optical flow hardware or using some sort of compute shader like AFMF probably is. It would also then be somewhat different than what you see in lossless scaling because it's integrated at the driver level, whereas lossless scaling is an app that is manipulating the window. And as a result, there's some different behavior. For example, if you were to use AFMF, what it typically does is I think it blends like FCAT frames together.
It does, yeah.
So it'll dither them.
Smooth motion.
But that doesn't happen with the NVIDIA stuff. So it is happening at some other level beforehand, and then it is presented, and then you could slap an FCAT border on it, and it actually reads an FCAT, which I was surprised about when I loaded it up. So it is potentially as a result of not manipulating the window, it may actually offer benefits of smoothness. Now, it launched last night, and I've only played 3 games with it, one of which is broken, unfortunately, at the moment, that I'll talk about in a second. But I did see it had a pretty significant performance detriment, I would say, for turning it on. For example, in this sequence when it's showing control, and I'll send this to Oliver, going up, it's the intro to the game. It is not doing a strict doubling of GPU limited performance. This is an RTX 5080 at 4K, TAA native, everything whacked to the highest. And you're seeing in a moment, it would be 54 FPS on the side without smooth motion on and 94. So it isn't an exact doubling, but it is at least costing in this area around 10%, a little bit more on the GPU to just do this process in general. So it isn't a strict doubling in a GPU limited scenario. It'll probably be a lot less, visibly less performant at something like 1440p, 1080p or lower. So that's what I imagine to see. The subjective experience, I tried it out subjectively looking at it in Quake 2 RTX, as well as in Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition very briefly. And there it seemed pretty normal on a VRR display. I wasn't noticing anything that seemed like really bad frame pacing, but I was also playing it at at a 240 hertz scenario where the base frame rate was already within the 100 to 120 FPS range. And I was bringing that up to around 200 to 240. So perturbations in frame time would be arguably less noticeable unless they were really broken. So that seemed all subjectively fine. It also automatically turns on auto low latency mode in the driver when you turn it on. It'll actually it'll say if you turn it on the NV app, it'll say enabled and then also auto low latency mode. So it's going to be reducing the amount of pre-queuing frames. I presume this is also going to stack with reflex. If you have reflex on in-game in a game that supports it, I don't see why it wouldn't. So you could potentially get similar to DLSS 3 or 4 levels of latency in a game that supports reflex, but obviously with much worse quality of those frames potentially at lower frame rates. So, I mean, I only looked at it, briefly. I'd say it was subjectively fine for my first look, but I was looking at it at very high frame rates. And I think if you were to bring it down to something like 60 internal or 40 internal, you would see similar breakup like that which we see with AFMF or loss of scaling. So, but these are all just predictions. I haven't looked specifically.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're showing that control footage, we're showing the glitching on shadows and stuff, which seems to be a Blackwell issue, right?
Yeah, loaded up the game first without it, and I noticed actually the game like froze the first time I played it. So maybe what's happening is the shader's compiling incorrectly, and then when it does finish compiling, whatever is brought out as Garbo. So all the shadows in the game are like flickering nonstop with this new Blackwell driver. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really have anything more to say to that. I couldn't actually get it working on Metro Exodus.
Okay.
And
well, there you go.
Control crashed, which didn't help. Yeah, any thoughts on this, Oliver?
No, I quite like these. I quite like what I've seen, at least, of fluid motion frames. I also quite like lossless scaling, which can now do up to 20x frame gen, which I've played a little bit with.
I've not checked it out yet.
Yeah, I haven't either yet, but yeah.
It's fun. It's not as good as like motion vector based techniques. It's like the quality level is kind of questionable, and certainly in a game that already has native frame generation, you'd never want to use it. But to me, it seems pretty cool, and I'm sure this is probably at least as good as that, even if they aren't doing any kind of like crazy MFG tricks here like lossless scaling does. So I think it's a cool thing to use, especially with like older games or emulated games where you really can't get any other solution working. I think it's pretty cool, and I've enjoyed it myself for sure, especially with emulators like PS3 emulators, stuff like that. Just throwing in an extra, getting your 30 FPS game to 60 FPS. That's kind of a cool and unexpected little development in computer graphics that you can actually do that nowadays.